Even though I'm often asked to define my business philosophy, I generally won't do so because I don't believe it can be taught as if it were a recipe. There aren't ingredients and techniques that will guarantee success. Parameters exist that, if followed, will ensure a business can continue, but you cannot clearly define our business success and then bottle it as you would a perfume. It's not that simple. To be successful, you have to be out there. You have to hit the ground running. And if you have a good team around you and more than your fair share of luck, you might make something happen. But you certainly can't guarantee it just by following someone else's formula. Business is a fluid, changing substance. And as far as I'm concerned, the Virgin Group will never stand still. It has always been a mutating, indefinable thing, and the past few years have demonstrated that. But it is only when you come to write a book such as this that you discover how far you still want to go. That's how I see this book, a comprehensive account of the first 50 or so years of my life, the struggling years, but also a work and a life in progress. This book was never intended to be as dry as a balance sheet, but will, I hope, give an idea of what has been important to my life and to the people around me thus far. Okay, so that is Richard Branson writing in his autobiography, and the book is called Losing My Virginity: How I Survived, Had Fun, and Made a Fortune Doing Business My Way. So this book was originally published in 1998, and I went back and checked my Amazon account, and the first time I read it was back in 2005. And rereading it now, almost 13 years later, I realized how much of it had fallen away from my memory. So Richard Branson is probably one of the most famous entrepreneurs of all time, like in history. Certainly one of the most famous living entrepreneurs. And what I forgot about it is how much of the book is what he's describing there. Struggle. And it's not until he sells, what surprised me now rereading it, and I'll get to it eventually, later in these podcasts, is it wasn't until he was able to sell Virgin Music, some 25 years after he started out as an entrepreneur, that he actually had, for the first time in his life, money to do other things that he wanted to do. So we'll go into detail about how he would just constantly build businesses, but never had too much money to speak of because he kept reinvesting in the business and keep expanding the Virgin Group. So one other thing before I also get back into the book is, as you probably saw in the title of this podcast, this is going to be part one of a multi-part series on Richard Branson. So in the past, there's been I've done multiple podcasts on certain people, Henry Ford, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, because there's multiple books written about their businesses. And what I want to start doing now, which I think is more helpful, is if I'm going to be covering entrepreneurs multiple times, I want to try to do it all at once. Like, there's probably 5 different books that I want to read on Steve Jobs. And so what I would do if I could go back and redo it, is I would do all of them in order, because you're reading about the same material, you have a deeper understanding as you continue. And I think that's a little better than, maybe doing one podcast on Henry Ford, for example, and then waiting 2 months. Sometimes you forget all the detail. So I'm going to this is an experiment, see how it works. But for Richard Branson, there's several books of his that I want to read. And I think this one, obviously, we should start with this one because it's an autobiography. He released another autobiography like a year or two ago, which I'm going to definitely read, and it'll be one of the parts in this multi-part series. But I think Losing My Virginity is the perfect place to start, because this is what I'm most interested in, and why I'm doing a podcast where I read biographies of entrepreneurs, is because, first of all, I think it's very inspiring. Not just my opinion, but, there's tons of other founders that have talked about the same thing. It's very inspiring about reading the life story of people that have accomplished something. And specifically for me is like seeing how they started out and how they, many times, they don't start out building massively profitable businesses. And in Richard Branson's case, he starts out just trying to run a magazine and then starts a record label and then an airline. And now to present day, Virgin Group is a collection of about 400 different companies. So we're going to spend a lot of time studying his early days. Before I get back into the book, though, I just want to remind you that Founders is supported by the people that get value from listening to this podcast. So once I get into back into the book, I'm not going to interrupt our time together with ads. And the only way I'm able to do that is if you get value from my work, if you'll support it directly by becoming a member. So if you go to founderspodcast.com/support, or you just click the link in the show notes in your podcast player, for a small monthly fee, essentially you could, it's the price of a cup of coffee. You could make sure that this work continues to get done. And not only that, you get access to the Founders Members exclusive episodes. So right now, as of today, if you sign up, you'd automatically unlock 11 additional podcasts that I've done just for members that are available nowhere else. Plus, I make a new members-only episode every week. So if you like the podcast I'm doing and if you're getting value out of it, please become a member. You could support at any level. Any monthly contribution level, they all get the same thing. So it's just totally up to you to decide what level of value that you get from this. Okay, so let's get into the book. And I just want to start with, there's just a paragraph from the prologue, and then I'm going to move through the book in chronological order. So this book very much reminds me of Phil Knight, the founder of Nike, his book, where all the chapters are named after the years in his life, which makes it really easy to understand the progression and to keep track of what's going on. But he's talking to us a little bit in the prologue about, what is Virgin Group and where is it going? And so I think that's a good introduction into his autobiography. And he says, the wider question of where the Virgin Group will end up is impossible to answer. Rather than be too academic about it all, which is not the way I think, I have written this book to demonstrate how we made Virgin what it is today. If you read carefully between the lines, you will understand what our vision for the Virgin Group is, and you will see where I am going. Some people say that my vision for Virgin breaks all the rules and is too wildly kaleidoscopic. Others say that Virgin has become one of the leading brand names of the century. Others analyze it down to the last degree and then write academic papers on it. And this sentence is, to me, the most important of the entire paragraph. As for me, I just pick up the phone and get on with it. So I'm going to skip ahead into his life. And before I get into that, there's just some one-liners that I've highlighted and taken notes on throughout the book. I just came across one of them right here. There's a lot of his thoughts that echo other founders that we've covered. And they're just I almost think that instead of calling it the Founders Members, it should be like Founders Misfits, because I think almost every single person, not only is it like an homage to the great Apple ad, here's to the crazy ones, but they're all the people that we are discussing together and that we're learning about together. They just don't fit into normal society. So he's reflecting on that from an early age, and he says, I think my parents must have instilled a rebellious streak in me. I have always thought rules were there to be broken. And to me, that echoes one of my favorite quotes that I've learned from doing this podcast, because now I'm up to almost 50 of these books read, and what is that? Probably hundreds of thousands of words. And it's just funny to me what actually sticks out even as time passes and I keep reading more of them is one of those concepts is the Yvon Chouinard, which is one of my favorite books, definitely in the top 5 out of the ones I've read. And he's the founder of Patagonia. If you haven't listened to that podcast, I would definitely recommend going back and reading it. And then, of course, buying his book. It's fantastic. But he has this great quote, and he says, if you want to understand the entrepreneur, study the juvenile delinquent. And we're going to get into that a little later when Richard gets arrested. So at this point in the book, he is starting a magazine, and it's called Student. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about that. I just wanted to highlight things that are useful for us. So this is smart ways to get initial traction when you're building a new product. And he says, I drew up lists and lists of people to call and slowly work my way down them. Most of them rejected the idea of paying for advertising in an unpublished magazine, but gradually I began to find ways of attracting their attention. So this whole thing about finding different unique ways to attract attention, that's something that you're going to see throughout Richard's life. And I think that gives him a huge creative edge over most other people building businesses, that he just constantly is like, okay, well, there's got to be a different way to do it than the way everybody else is doing it. And so this is an example. He just said, hey, we haven't even made our first edition of the student magazine, yet I'm going to find a way to sell advertising. And he says, I called up Coca-Cola and told them that Pepsi had just booked a big advertisement, but that the back page was still free. I then called up the Daily Telegraph, these are newspapers, and asked them whether they would prefer to advertise before or after the Daily Express. So he's playing, what he's doing here is obviously he's playing their, calling up Coca-Cola, hey, do you want to advertise in Student Magazine? They're just going to hang up on you. But if you start the conversation and frame it in a different way, like, hey, Pepsi just took an ad, but, we still have some advertising space in the back. They're like, oh, okay, Pepsi's doing it. Maybe we should do it as well. So around this time, he says, my schoolwork was going from bad to worst, but I was giving myself a wonderful lesson in confidence building. And this is such an important point about the naivete of young people. Had I been 5 or 6 years older, the sheer absurdity of trying to sell advertising to major companies in a magazine that did not yet exist, edited by two 15-year-old schoolboys, would have prevented me from picking up the phone at all. But I was too young to contemplate failure. So embedded in that paragraph, he starts his first business at 15 years old. Something that I don't know, there's this phenomenon, I can't remember what it's called, but once you're made aware of something, you start seeing that same thing over and over again, even though it probably already existed all the time. So like think about when you buy a new car and suddenly when you're driving on the road, you see all these other people that have the same car as you that you may not have noticed before. And so as I'm reading these books week to week, there's just been a theme that maybe it's just on my mind now because I've been thinking a lot about what kind of parent I want to be and reading about parenting and just questioning my assumptions to make sure that I do a good job. And so this is a reminder for myself, and I just want to share it with you. The note I left myself is be good parents. And he's talking about, the support that he got from parents. And this echoed something that Paul Allen talked about. We talked about it last week with Ken Langone. And he said, I was lucky. I always felt that I could speak to my parents as if they were my closest friends. Rather than closing down on me, they reacted very well to this letter, and we kept open our lines of communication. At about this time, I noticed that a good many of my friends stopped confiding in their parents, but I never felt embarrassed or rebellious towards mine. They always encouraged me to go ahead and do whatever I wanted to do. And if they did not always praise my projects, they never expressed less than sympathy and support. So two things I just want to elaborate on here is the letter. He's writing a letter to his parents at 16 years old, apologizing for the little time he spent with his family over Easter because he's trying to build the magazine Student. And the second thing is when he talks about they always encourage me to go ahead and do whatever I want to do, even if they didn't always praise my projects. There's an alternate reality where he had different parents and he's not the Richard Branson who he is today without the support and encouragement that he got clearly at a very young age. So he, like many of the people we cover on the podcast he's a really crappy student. He did not like structured learning. And so this is another example. To understand the entrepreneur, study the juvenile delinquent. So he's leaving school. And he says, when I left in 1967, aged almost 17, my headmaster's parting words to me were, Congratulations, Branson. I predict that you will either go to prison or become a millionaire. And he does both of those things, actually. They wind up not being mutually exclusive. Okay, so I'm always fascinated when we're able to capture, because if you're going to study your opinions on business when you first start out, and how you structure the company you do, or any work that you do really, is going to change over time as you expose yourself to more ideas and have different experiences that you're hopefully learning from. So we're going to capture a little bit of Richard's early business philosophy here. And he says, I was becoming an entrepreneur almost by default. Although if anybody had mentioned the word to me then, I probably would have to ask what it meant. I certainly didn't regard myself as a businessman. Businessmen were middle-aged men in the city, obsessed with making money. So this word, the city, I had to look it up because I didn't understand what he meant. Obviously not from England, and it's their financial district. So as I understand it, it's like their version of Wall Street. They wore pinstripe suits and had wives and 2.4 children in the suburbs. Of course we needed money to survive, but we saw it much more as a creative enterprise than a money-making one. So he's very much into like counterculture at this time. He wasn't too heavy into drugs, even though most of his friends were at the time. Very much into free love. That's one thing that's not in the podcast, but is in the book constantly. He's very graphic descriptions of his sex life, which I've never come across in an autobiography of an entrepreneur before. Let me go back to this paragraph. So it's saying, hey, this is a more creative enterprise than a money-making one that, we just need to make money so we can continue doing what we're doing. Later, it became apparent to me that business could be a creative enterprise in itself. If you publish a magazine, you're trying to create something that is original, that stands out from the crowd, that will last and hopefully serve some useful purpose. Above all, you want to create something you're proud of. That has always been my philosophy of business. I can honestly say that I have never gone into any business purely to make money. If that is the sole motive, then I believe you are better off not doing it. So when I heard this, when I was younger and I heard this this advice, because I've heard it before, I always thought it was like silly nonsense. And then you realize that at a certain point, if money is your only motivator, you're going to stop doing what you're doing. Or you're going to be deeply unhappy, since money really can't buy happiness above a certain amount of money. But if you're loving what you're doing and you're being creative and it's something you're proud of, then you're going to spend more time on it. You're going to work harder at it, and it's going to be better. And that, along with that, will come money. I didn't, when I was younger, I didn't understand that distinction. So he says a business has to be, and he's going to summarize this here. A business has to be involving. It has to be fun, and it has to exercise your creative instincts. And their distinction is, this entire book is about struggle and stress and being on the precipice of bankruptcy constantly. So these are not by themselves fun things. But what he was doing, the challenge, he talks about how, it's up to you, echoing what Ray Dalio taught us a few weeks ago. You have to be who you are. And for Richard Branson, he wanted to his main goal in life was to set these big, audacious goals and see if he could rise to the challenge. So that was fun to him. That doesn't mean every day is going to be fun. And I think that's something, I had to struggle to understand for a long time. Okay. So this is the beginning of Virgin. And he's doing the magazine. It's not really going well. And this is how he gets in. The first Virgin business is going to be the record store. So it says, one thing I knew from everyone who came in to chat or work for us was that they spent a good deal of their time listening to music and a good deal of money buying records. He's talking about people that came into the student magazine. And he talks about these are the kind of people. He goes, people who would never dream of spending as much as 40 shillings on a meal wouldn't hesitate to spend 40 shillings buying the latest Bob Dylan album. I began to think about setting up a record distribution business. I thought about the high cost of records and the sort of people who bought Student Magazine and wondered whether we could advertise and sell cheap mail order records through the magazine. As it turned out, the first advertisement for mail order records appeared in the final edition of Student. So something that he talks about a lot, I would categorize as second order effects. It's starting an opportunity, understanding you don't know where that opportunity is going to lead you to, but then once you get to that next level, it's easier to hop to the next opportunity because you're already at a different place in life. So if he never, even the student was struggling and was not necessarily successful, if he didn't start Student, he wouldn't have realized, hey, all the people that are interested Student, Like, you just noticed this anomaly. Like, why would they be so cheap to feed themselves? But because they have such a passion for music that they'll buy Bob Dylan's new album. And so that led him to this next opportunity. So they put in an advertisement saying, hey, we're going to sell records. And they put it in their own magazine. And it went crazy. So it says, but the offer of cheap records brought in a flood of inquiries and more cash than we had ever seen before. So overnight, from a very struggling magazine, he's on the phone all day trying to sell advertising, to, hey, people are just handing over money because we're able to sell records slightly cheaper than the next guy. So he said, we decided to come up with another name for the mail order business, a name that would be eye-catching, that would stand alone and not appeal to just students. So he has a young woman working for him, and she goes, I know, she said, what about Virgin? We're complete virgins at business. Great, I decided on the spot. It's Virgin. So two things happening here. One, what I'm awed at is Richard's ability to make decisions rapidly. He talks about within the first 30 seconds, he kind of summarizes what he feels about people and what about like the value of business opportunities. Maybe this comes from being dyslexic and a bad student, but he really feels that he has no other choice but to rely on his intuition. The second thing is this whole thing about complete virgins at business. Again, going back, he's in a group of basically counterculture socialists. Not the people, like if you looked at his peer group around this age, you would never think that out of this group is going to become one of the most influential entrepreneurs or business people, of all time. But I think that really does speak to the value in his approach of like, hey, can I make business fun? Like, it doesn't, who says, going back to like Danny Meyer, right? If you, one of my favorite things about reading that book and doing that podcast a few months ago, it might have been a year ago by now, but, was his whole idea is like, whoever said, and that's basically his way to get to first principles thinking. Like, whoever said that you had to have, like, you couldn't have a nice upscale restaurant that wasn't overly expensive, or whoever said that you couldn't have a new take on barbecue and that you could have a successful barbecue restaurant in New York. And he has all these other examples in the book, but of just a way to get to the idea is like, am what I'm being told actually true, or is it just conventional wisdom that may be a little bit outdated? So he winds up going to jail. I'm going to skip over because I think the story's pretty well known, but if not, it's in the book if you read it. And it's this idea that he figured out how to save on taxes by basically faking like he was going to export or import records, and it was just like convoluted scheme about like driving across borders and suddenly you save, $5,000 or whatever the number is. So it's illegal at the time. I think it probably still is today. And he winds up in jail. And so I'm going to skip over the story, but the important part is the lesson that he took away from it. And this is what he learned from going to jail. That night was one of the best things that has ever happened to me. As I lay in the cell and stared at the ceiling, I felt complete claustrophobia. I have never enjoyed being accountable to anyone else or not being in control of my own destiny. I have always enjoyed breaking the rules, whether they were school rules or accepted conventions, such as that no 17-year-old can edit a national magazine. As a 21-year-old, I had lived in life entirely on my own terms, following my own instincts. But to be in prison meant that all the freedom was taken away. I was locked in a cell and utterly dependent on somebody else to open the door. I vowed to myself that I would never again do anything that would cause me to be imprisoned, or indeed do any kind of business deal by which I would ever have to cause to be embarrassed. In the many different business worlds I have inhabited since that night in prison, there have been times when I could have succumbed to some form of bribe, or could have had my way by offering one. But ever since that night in prison, I have never been tempted to break my vow. My parents had always drummed into me that all you have in life is your reputation. You may be very rich, but if you lose your good name, you'll never be happy. I had never really focused on what a good name truly meant, but that night in prison made me understand. And this is, so as you heard, now he's 21 years old. This is the scope of his ambition at 21 years old. At the same time, I had the customs fine, the mortgage, and the thought of prison hanging over me. So the customs fine, I think he has to pay like $75,000 over the next like 3 or 4 years, or he'd risk going back to jail. And it says, the mail order business was doing well, but mainly seemed to attract the serious music buyers who were looking for quite rare records. It seemed difficult to expand it further. We realized that if we were going to make money, it would have to come from opening up more Virgin record shops. Nick, this is his co-founder, and I began a program of serious expansion. Towards the end of 1971 and throughout 1972, we aimed to open a shop every month. By Christmas 1972, we had 14 record shops. We reached 21 at the time. Several in London and one in every big city across the country. But here's why I included this in the podcast, because I think it's a really good idea. After negotiating the lease until we were sure that the landlords would go no lower, we would push for a rent-free period for the first 3 months. This was the single most crucial element. When we opened, we knew that record sales in the first 3 months would help pay for rent on the previous shop that we had opened. The sales also demonstrated, without committing to a huge overhead, whether the site we had chosen attracted enough people off the streets to make the shop viable. So this whole idea of continuing to expand and then taking the money that you made and expanding further is his modus operandi up until he achieves financial freedom, which I think at the time he must have been, I don't know the age, he might have been close to 40 years old. Let's see, we're going to skip ahead. So this is we see more insights into something that he does later on. He's still in his 20s, but he has an idea in his mind of a model of compatible businesses. And so they're having some success with the Virgin record stores. He's like, well, is there any of these like related businesses that we could open up that kind of like almost like a vertical integration into the music industry? So he says, if Virgin set up a record label, we could offer artists somewhere to record for which we could charge them. So let me back up. So right now he has the chain of Virgin record stores, right? Then he bought this house that he calls the Manor, and he did it because he wanted to have a recording studio where people could go and basically live at while they were making their album and then record whenever they wanted to. He's saying at the time, recording studios were so tightly scheduled that you could have somebody like the Rolling Stones come in and they'd have to record at 9 a.m., and they'd have exactly 2 hours, and then they'd have to leave, and they'd have to go and spend some of that time setting up their own instruments and doing everything else. He's like, why isn't just we have a place where you could stay? It's a big old like mansion kind of thing. And if instead of maybe you don't want to record at 9 in the morning, maybe you want to record from 11 p.m. till 5 in the morning, and then you want to take a few days off or whatever your creative process is. So that's what he's talking about. We could offer artists somewhere to record, which we could charge them. So it says if we have the record label, we also have the recording studio. We could publish and release their records, from which we could make a profit, and we had a large and growing chain of shops where we could promote and sell their records, and again make the retail profit margin. The three businesses were mutually compatible and would also benefit the bands we signed, since we could reduce prices at the Manor, that's the recording studio, the manufacturing end, and increase promotion at the shops, the retail end, while still making our own profit. This is exactly what they wind up doing. And this whole idea of a record label is probably, it is what actually got him his biggest break, because in the future, I think about 20 years from where we are now, he sells that record label for $1 billion. And this is, now, he uses the word fortune here, but, those are things of a matter of scale. But this is him telling us how he made his first fortune. He said most small record labels licensed their records since it was easy money. They received 16% royalties from the other company, meaning like a large distributor. Okay, we're going to go into some numbers here, so hopefully this isn't too confusing. So most little, at the time, Virgin Records is very small. They're expected to just license their records, and they would receive 16% royalties from the other company and paid out whatever they had agreed to an artist, say 5 or 10% out of that 16%. But Simon, this is the guy that he co-founded Virgin Records with, and I decided that we would go for a manufacture and distribution deal. Again, the thing I'm most impressed with Richard is like he has a set of fresh eyes to any deal that he does, and he winds up negotiating in a way that limits his downside and caps his downside and leaves his upside virtually unlimited. And this is one way he does it here. So they have these distribution deals called pressing and distribution. It's also referred to as P&D. It was a bold move, but even then I knew that it was a bold move, but even then I knew that it is only by being bold that you get anywhere. If you are a risk taker, then the art is to protect the downside. It seemed to us that Tubular Bells was so good that we could promote it ourselves. So he's talking about the very first signee. The record label is a guy named Mike Oldfield, I think is how you pronounce his last name. He made this it's very esoteric and bizarre album called Tubular Bells that was 45 minutes long with no lyrics. And that actually going to be a huge hit for them. So he's like, okay, well, this is what we want to do instead. He goes to Island Records. He said, no, we don't want your standard deal. We want the P&D deal. They refuse at first. So they offered us a highly attractive licensing deal instead with royalties of 18%. We were paying Mike 5%, which meant that if we accepted Island's offer, we could collect 13% on the sales of Tubular Bells for ourselves. So it says, which would mean a total profit of us around $171,000 if the record did astonishingly well and sold, say, 600,000 copies. Okay, so if you sell 600 in the standard licensing deal, they'd make about 171,000. If we reached 1 million copies, then Virgin would make 285,000 without having to pay for any of the cost of promoting and marketing the record. Most small record companies in our place would have accepted it, and certainly both Island and our lawyers urged us to do so. But Simon and I felt differently. We had 14 Virgin record shops across the country which could promote Tubular Bells. If sales of Tubular Bells had faded, Virgin Music would have been dead in the water. But if we managed to sell 600,000 copies, Virgin would receive around 920,000. So on their deal, saying, hey, we just want you to press and distribute. We're gonna take care of the marketing and promotion ourselves, right? Which is kind of what he's known for. And so the difference is at 600,000 copies, they'd go from making, let's say, 171,000 to 920. So what's the worst case? Like, why wouldn't you try to cap your marketing expenses at that point and have a much greater upside? You're talking about the upside's almost 4x. Oh, I guess he's going to say, I'm jumping ahead. I'm running over my own highlight. He says, this was the upside. The intellectual copyright of Tubular Bells was our birthright, and we were determined to build on it. So we turned down Island's offer and insisted that we stick to a P&D deal. We committed ourselves, this is so important, we committed ourselves to selling Tubular Bells with our own resources. We became rich beyond our dreams as the sales of Tubular Bells shot up over 1 million copies. Remember, they were thinking, hey, if we could just be so lucky to sell 600,000 copies, we'd make about 900,000. So they sell over 1 million. Tubular Bells went on to sell millions of copies and still sells around the world today. Our gamble that we could promote it ourselves made us our first fortune. Something that I'd say Richard's pretty famous for is the fact that he owned his own island, and it's called Necker Island, in case you weren't familiar with it. What I found shocking, and why I included this part in the podcast, is how little he paid for it. So he has this idea. He's dating what's soon to be his wife, Joan. They have really no money to speak of at the time, even though he just said a few years earlier that they made their first fortune. They would now we're about 8 years after the fact. They reinvested most of that into other acts. They have tons of debt, so they use that money to pay off like the mortgage on the manor or pay down some of that. They use it as collateral to get more loans for banks because, again, his whole thing is he's this kind of psychotic guy that wakes up every day trying to expand his empire in these really unique ways. And he's fighting in industries. It's not like, these are highly competitive industries, so it's not like there's high profit margins. So he comes up with this idea that, hey, I want to go to the Virgin Islands with this beautiful woman that I'm dating. He knew that they still have these arrangements today. If you say, hey, I want, you talk to like salespeople, they're trying to sell real estate in these islands. that you're interested in buying real estate, they'll fly you down and put you up in accommodations just to have the sales pitch to you. So he does that. And they wind up landing on Necker Island. And I'm just going to skip over this part so we can get to the main point. But he says, how much does he want for it? I asked, meaning Necker Island. $3 million. How much were you thinking about spending? This is now the real estate agent. The estate agent asked, suddenly smelling a rat. We could offer $150,000, I said. $200,000, I added, trying to make it sound more. I see. As we flew back to the villa, it was clear that we were no longer welcome. So not only are they no longer welcome, this guy, they pack up their bags and they have to leave that same day. So he says, back in London later, I found out that the owner of Necker Island wanted to sell it in a hurry. He wanted to construct a building somewhere in Scotland, which would cost him around $200,000. I upped my offer to $175,000 and held on for 3 months. Finally, I got a call. If you're to offer $180,000, it's yours. There was never a hint that $180,000 was only a fraction of the $3 million asking price. So I agreed on the spot, and Necker Island was ours. Even at such a low price, there was a snag. The Virgin Islands government had decreed that whoever bought Necker would have to develop it within 5 years of its ownership. Would have to develop it within 5 years of its ownership, or its ownership would pass to them. It would cost a good deal to build a house and pipe the water across from the neighboring island, but I was determined to make enough money to afford it. So in the very next paragraph, so this section could be called How He Gets Necker Island and the idea for Virgin Airways. So they're staying on this thing called Beef Island. So it says, Joan and I stayed on Beef Island for the rest of that holiday, and it was there where I set up Virgin Airways. We were trying to catch a flight to Puerto Rico, but the local Puerto Rican scheduled flight was canceled. The airport terminal was full of stranded passengers. I made a few calls to charter companies and agreed to charter a plane for $2,000 to Puerto Rico. I divided the price by the number of seats, borrowed a blackboard, and wrote Virgin Airways, $39 single flight to Puerto Rico. I walked around the airport terminal and soon filled every seat on the charter plane. As we landed at Puerto Rico, a passenger turned to me and said, Virgin Airways isn't too bad. Smarten up the service a little and you could be in business. I might just do that, I laughed. Okay, so this is another example of how I was saying earlier that you don't, these like second order effects, like you can't get to another opportunity unless something happens before that. So that little anecdote or story about setting up Virgin Islands, that happened, let's say 1979, 1980. It's not till 3 or 4 years later that he actually does set up Virgin Airlines for real. And this is something I think, like, if I could only say, if I could say, hey, what's the one most important thing that you learned from reading Richard Branson's autobiography, is this idea of optionality. That he always protected his downside risk. This is one of the examples where I wish I had the Kindle version of the book, because you can search for specific, like how many times a specific term appears in the book. And this whole thing is protect downside, limit downside. What's our downside? Cap our downside. I have to, like, I would guess that it appears 20 times in the book. So this is the way he does that, and he's always trying to broaden Virgin. So we don't have to rely on a single source of income. So there's two things, the two notes on that page is a really good way to summarize Richard's approach to business. It's like, let's cap down our downside risk, right? Maintain our optionality, and make sure that we're not relying on single source of income. So this is the start of Virgin Airways. In February 1984, a young American lawyer called Randolph Fields asked me whether I was interested in operating an airline. He sent me a proposal which I read. It was obvious that he had contacted lots of other investors before me. A record label owner is hardly going to be his first call. So I skimmed through the proposal and I kept saying to myself, don't get tempted. Don't even think about it. In the same way that I tend to make up my mind about people within 30 seconds of meeting them, I also make up my mind about whether a business proposal excites me within about 30 seconds of looking at it. I rely far more on gut instinct than researching huge amounts of statistics. The idea of operating a Virgin airline grabbed my imagination, but I had to work out in my own mind what the potential risks were. I wrote out a list of things. Keep in mind, we're going to get to this in a minute, but lists are very important in the way he operates his life. I wrote out a list of things I wanted to understand about how the aircraft leasing would work. If I could lease the plane for one... Okay, so before I read it, this is... I don't remember if it came from this book, if it came from a YouTube video or a previous podcast I had heard. But this is one of the most famous, like, Richard Branson stories I ever heard about, like, how do you start an airline by... Remember, we started this section with how do you protect your downside risk? Because starting an airline seems like it's unbelievably capital intensive, right? Well, this is how he comes up with it. He goes, if I could lease the plane for 1 year and then have the chance to return the plane, we would have a clear escape route if it all failed. It would be embarrassing, but we would limit the amount of money we lost. By the end of the weekend, I had made up my mind. If we could limit everything to 1 year, the employment contracts, the leasing of the aircraft, the exchange exposure, and anything else that starting up a New York route involved, then I wanted to have a shot at it. I think that's a really good idea. Like, who starts an airline? Said, it's really like an experiment. It's going to be a 1 year experiment. Can we do something here of value within 1 year? I think that could be applied to everything that you're working on. I just heard a variation of this. I was taking notes on this podcast of a founder that started a podcast. She just got into Y Combinator, and the way she started her business is like, can I do a 4-week test to see if there's actually like demand here that I could fulfill, as opposed to, a lot of people they keep their idea hidden. They work on it for 12, 18 months, 2 years, whatever, and then just it doesn't work out. And they're like, crap, I wish I could have got to that failure point faster. So Richard's saying, hey, I'm going to do this in a year. I forgot her name. I can't remember. I wasn't expecting to talk about this, but she did it in 4 weeks, and it was like, how do you do vetted childcare? And she winds up now building a business that is relatively successful just off of a 4-week test, which, again, that's her maintaining optionality and limiting her downside. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit in the book. And this is the problem with co-founders. We talk about this a number of times, how it's really hard to maintain co-founder relationships. It's like it's hard to stay married, right, and be happy. And this is a problem with co-founders and Richard's philosophy on life. And this is him kind of arguing with one of the co-founders of Virgin Records, Simon. It says, the argument that lunchtime was a turning point in my relationship with Simon. Over the years, I had unnerved him several times. But this time, he felt that I was prepared to bet the company and all our accumulated wealth on a scheme that he thought was totally harebrained. So Simon's like, don't do the airline. Like, just stick to record. Like, we're in the music industry. Why are we going into this, what Richard calls a lateral move? Simon's interest and love for life comes from the arts, from music, books, his collections of paintings, and beautiful cars. And now we're going to hear Richard's philosophy. My interest in life comes from setting myself huge, apparently unachievable challenges and trying to rise above them. From a purely commercial perspective, Simon was absolutely right. But from the viewpoint of wanting to live life to the full, I felt I had to attempt it. From that lunchtime onward, a tension sprang up in our relationship, which never fully dissolved. Okay, so I always like to discuss numbers because I feel, I don't know, to me, they just got to kind of like level me. Like they give me like an anchor in reality. It gives like a context that words don't, even though I love words, obviously. But in 1984, just want to show you a little bit about Virgin's growth. 1984, they made $12 million in profit. They had 3,000 employees. He's around 33 years old at the time. And think about how crazy it is to start an airline at 33. By 1986, right, so that's 2 years later, they have 4,000 employees, sales of $189 million, and a pre-tax profit of $19 million. So wait, let me redo that so it's a little more understandable. In 1984, profit of 12 million, 3,000 employees. 1985, profit of 15 million, so went up another 3 million. And then the 1987, 19 million. So, 2-3 million a year they're adding. And this is on sales of anywhere from 119 million to 189 million. And he's employing at this time anywhere from 3,000 to 4,000 people. Now, this is very interesting. I didn't know. So again, I hadn't read the book in 13 years, something like that. And I'm halfway through the book and I'm like, what the hell? Like, they're talking about Virgin being a public company. Like, I thought it was private. I forgot that Virgin at one point went public, and then he took it private because he hated being a public company. So I always like to explore this because I find it interesting. I find all aspects of business interesting, from one person building a product by themselves all the way up to these giant public companies. My own personal philosophy is I think smaller is better, but I do understand some people want to build a giant conglomerate, and in some cases they want to make that public, even though you could have a private conglomerate, which is what Virgin Group is today. But it's just fascinating to me about people's opinion. There's not a right way. It just depends on who you are and what's important to you. And in his case, he hated being public, and we're gonna find out why. Okay. Firstly, the city had insisted that Virgin appoint some non-executive directors. I found it difficult to comply with all the formality that the city insisted we adopt. I was used to chatting with Simon and Ken about which bands to sign and then letting them get on with it. Virgin board meetings had always been highly informal affairs. I found our business was not one that could be boxed into a rigid timetable of meetings. We had to make decisions quickly and off the cuff. My own personal philosophy is very much in alignment here. I would much rather keep things informal. He's talking about the difficulty to comply with formality. I think that's a great way to put it. I definitely empathize with that. So he said, I also had a number of disagreements, notably about dividends. I was extremely reluctant to follow British tradition and pay out a large dividend. I preferred the American or Japanese tradition whereby a company concentrates on reinvesting its profits to build itself and increase share value. He makes a good point here. To me, a large dividend meant a loss of cash, which would be better employed within Virgin than by paying it away. It seemed to me that our outside shareholders had entrusted their money to Virgin in order for us to make it grow, not for us to hand back 5% of it, not to hand 5% of it back on a plate, which would then be taxed as income and so immediately lose 40% of its value. This may sound like a petty argument, but it illustrates the general loss of control I experience. So there's that word control again. Something that you and I talk about constantly is why are you, or is this person that we're studying, an entrepreneur? Is it because they want to make a lot of money, they want to build fame, they want to change the course of an industry? In many cases, it comes down to a lot of these people is they want control. So it says, most people think that 50% of a public company is the key to controlling it. While this is true in theory, to a large extent, you lose control just by having to appoint non-executive directors and generally giving up your time to satisfy the city. Previously, I had always felt confident about any decision we made, but now Virgin was a publicly quoted company. I began to lose faith in myself. I felt uneasy about making the rapid decisions I had always made. So now you could see that it's causing the idea that you can hypothetically determine the entire value of the company at any given time, and it's readily accessible to everybody, makes him kind of doubt himself, where before he would just, really trust his gut and then realize that, most of the decisions we make, they're reversible. So I'm going to make a decision quick, and then if it's wrong, I'll just, backtrack and I'll go a different direction. So now he's losing that ability. And this is the result. In many ways, 1987, our year of being a public company, was Virgin's least creative. We spent at least 50% of our time heading off to the city to explain what we were doing to fund managers, financial advisors, and city PR firms, rather than just getting on and doing it. Okay, so he said, they were a public company for 1 year. So this is how he takes Virgin private. He tweets out that funding is secured at $420 a share. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That that was somebody else. But this is how he takes Virgin private. Let me give you some background before I get into it. They spent about $35 million buying up public stock of this other record distributor called Thorn EMI. And then right during this happens, there's a massive stock market crash. So it says the share price of Thorn EMI had dropped from $7.30 a share to $5.80, a drop of over 20%. And the value of our shareholding had crashed to $18 million. So skip, and then it says, I guess this isn't that important, but somebody calculated that he had lost $41 million of personal wealth in his shares of Virgin Group just from the stock market crash. Since I was focusing much more on profits and cash flow from EMI, I began to see the stock market crash as a golden opportunity to buy the company. That week, I had a furious argument with two non-executive directors with whom we had brought in to represent the outside shareholders' interest when Virgin went public. So these two non-executive directors were utterly opposed to continuing the siege of Thorn EMI. He thought it was a great idea. He had an idea of these guys had huge back catalogs, and he thought you could make a lot more money off them than you could with like cassettes, and then eventually he does this later with CDs. And this is his counter-argument, but it's a unique buying opportunity, I said. It simply cannot be true that Thorn is now worth only 2/3 of its value on Friday. We know the cash we can earn from its back catalog. So in terms of straight cash to us, it's a bargain. I could not persuade them, and I had to let the matter drop. That stock market crash was the final nail in Virgin's coffin as a public company. Trevor and I set about finding other companies who might wish to invest in any of the Virgin subsidiaries as joint ventures. We wanted to replace the shareholders in the city with one or two key partners in various Virgin subsidiaries. The structure of the Virgin Group was about to become extremely complicated. So he does this. Okay, so I want to stop, I guess, before I get to finishing how he goes private. This whole thing about how it's going to get a lot more complicated, I didn't know. So he has this term that he uses later on in the book describing Virgin Group as branded venture capital. And I don't know if I'm just ignorant to that, but I've never heard that term before. Obviously know what venture capital is, but I never heard branded venture capital. So I was shocked when I was doing some other research. I was like, how does Virgin Group have 400 companies? Like, that's insane to me. So this whole idea is, once they do, so he starts doing this, you're going to see this because he's going to sell 25% of Virgin Music for about $100 million. Once he finally sells Virgin Music a few years from now, and he reaps, I think after they pay off all their debts and everything else, I think he has like $500 million in the bank. And he's still, now for the first time in his life, banks don't get to tell him what to do. And he sets up the structure where, and it's actually, to me, like the structure has a fundamental understanding of human nature. He doesn't like big companies, right? So what he does is he takes on these usually 50-50 partnerships. So he says, okay, we're going to do, a clothing company, a cola company, whatever, Virgin, they have 1 million of these things. How he does this, he says, he finds somebody that's either already an entrepreneur or is entrepreneurially minded, says, hey, we're going to come in, you're going to own 50% of the company. So you have a huge incentive. Remember what Ken Langone said last week about why he gave that guy the truck company? He winds up making like $150 million from having 20% of this company because he gave the majority of the company to the guy running it because that guy has a larger incentive to make the company successful. That's basically what Richard's doing here. He says, okay, you're going to call your new company, let's say Virgin Cola or whatever. You're going to own 50% of it. It's going to be a small company. Usually most of his companies have less than 60 employees. And we're going to come in. You're going to use our branding. We're going to put up some of the money, and then you run the company, and then we're going to share 50% of the profit moving forward. And so what happens is he has these they almost like a bunch of options, like these financial instruments where 10 of them fail. It's okay because he's got 390 of them, 390 other ones. And so he's got a diversified, he's got a cap downside, so he's maintaining his optionality. He's got an extremely diversified income stream, and he has all the upside in the world because some of these, they start out like I think it was like a small airline, like a subsidiary of Virgin Airways in Australia, that I think they started with like $3 million and winds up going on and making them like $250 million. So you see that, like, we use this, all I can lose in this airline is $3 million, but he winds up making a whole lot more. Now it gets, very complicated. Like, how are you going to, there's no central organization, but they're loosely tied to a bunch of holding companies. And within each holding company is a bunch of tiny companies. It kind of reminds me of, and this is, not that it's important, but like it echoes my own personal philosophy of like businesses, much more in line with, remember what Edwin Land said, the founder of Polaroid? He had this dream of 1,000 small companies instead of one large Polaroid, and that each company would be doing like 20 million, I forgot the numbers exactly, let's say 25 million in revenue every year, and every company would dedicate like 10 or 20% of their annual budget to R&D. And so what you have is these hugely diversified like scientific machines, because his primary purpose was not business, but inventing technologies that help people. And with the Polaroid camera, he did work for the Defense Department. He's the one that solved, I was just telling you the story a few days ago, he was the one that solved why we can drive at night and not be blinded by oncoming headlights. That's polarization that he invented 80 years ago that still exists today. So Edwin Land's, if you read the book Insisting on Impossible, his whole dream about these 1,000 small companies, all diversified and reinvesting their money in R&D, which was his primary goal, is very similar to what Richard Branson's doing. Although I think with Edwin Land, he was more important about inventing new technology. Richard Branson, he'll jump into already existing businesses like airlines, trains, bridal gowns, all that kind of stuff. So, all right. So that was a hell of a tangent, but I never know when I sit down what I'm going to talk to you about. I just know what my highlights and notes say. So I kind of have to go wherever my thoughts go at this moment. Okay, so he winds up being correct about going private. He does this. He says, by selling 25% of Virgin Music for $100 million, we had vindicated our argument that the city, meaning the public, had undervalued Virgin. The sale was a clear sign that the company alone was worth at least $400 million. Another thing, I keep using the word dollars. He's talking about in pounds. I know there's no way I'm going to keep that straight, so 400 million, he's talking about pounds. I keep saying dollars. Just know that every time he's referencing, he's obviously going to do it in his local currency. And that was without any value at all placed on the various other companies, such as retail, which had made up the public group. That's what he means about being complicated. This was way above the 180 million pounds at which the city had valued us before we'd offered to buy the company back, and was still above the 240 million pound price we had eventually paid to go private. So it cost them 240 to go private. They just sold 100 million out of one of their, Virgin Music is the most profitable one, but they sold 25% of just one of their businesses for, what is that? Almost a little under 40%, about around 40% of what they had placed the value at and what he was able to buy the company back from. So he wound up being vindicated and being right. And I think, if you could make the money of a public company but be private, I think everybody would pick to be private. So now I'm skipping ahead in the book because I think that the important thing is that we realize that even though we might be impressed by the accomplishments of the people that we're studying on this podcast and that their lives appear in the books, and rightfully so, they accomplish some wonderful things, there's just an element to human nature that can't be avoided. And it's, we all have to deal with these bouts when we're not feeling well. And this is, he's writing rather honestly. On the outside, looking in, at this time in his life, we're in 1990, it looks like he's got it all. And that's not how he's feeling. So I just want to spend a little time reading this part too, just because, no one's life is perfect. We're just all human beings trying to figure out our way through life. And it's normal to not always feel 100% or happy for that matter. So he said, we had celebrated my 40th birthday the previous month. I had found myself feeling uncharacteristically depressed. Turning 40 had also made me wonder what I was doing with my life. After the great leap into setting up Virgin Atlantic, I now found that it was difficult to develop the airline as quickly as I wanted. I began to question whether I should start doing something completely different. And a few pages later, we see more of this. And this is, I heard somebody call this the entrepreneurial roller coaster, that the highs are the highest highs you ever feel and the lows are the lowest lows you ever feel. And so it's just a reminder that, no one's immune to this. So he says, in September 1991, when it really looked as if my world was falling apart, after the high point of signing Janet Jackson and getting into Heathrow earlier that year, everything was now going wrong. So the previous year, he didn't know what he was doing. He felt depressed. He was still feeling that way even after, having two of the biggest highlights of his career, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? With the burden of funding the Janet Jackson deal, even Virgin Music was having difficulties. And the airline was stretched almost to breaking point by trying to operate out of both Gatwick and Heathrow. On top of that, the rumors about Virgin's financial troubles were mounting. And this is he's describing his emotional state here. It was like being engulfed in a bushfire. Although I kept stamping out flames, I was aware that more and more people were talking about my impending bankruptcy. I had taken so many telephone calls from journalists demanding to know whether our checks were bouncing that I could barely think straight. And on the very next page, it says, "Will Richard Branson's balloon burst?" was the headline on The Guardian. It was on the headline of The Guardian. The entire page of The Guardian's business section was devoted to discussing my debts. And this is a quote from the article. It says, "Behind the man with the Midas touch, there is a picture of a highly indebted and not very profitable conglomerate." And up until that point, that is a very accurate description of his business. So we now know he sells the record label, has this huge fight with British Airways, and he winds up coming out of it to now where, his company's estimated to be worth about $5 billion. But the whole point of the beginning of this book was, that it was very much a struggle. And he doesn't get to the point where he feels, I call it the opportunity of a lifetime. And that doesn't happen till the mid-90s. So that's where I'm going to leave the book today. If you want the full story and you want to support this podcast at the same time, go to founderspodcast.com/books. If you buy this book or any of the other 45-ish books that I've covered so far on the podcast, it's a great way for you to get a book, and Amazon sends me a small percentage of the sale at no additional cost to you. So it's a win-win. It's very good for you and very good for founders. If you want to learn more about Richard Branson, keep in mind, every week I do additional member-only podcasts. So this week, the Richard Branson version of that, we're going to go into the dirty tricks that British Airways played on Virgin Atlantic. We're going to go into how they actually forced him. He admits losing that battle, so they forced him to sell Virgin Music. How you can have a feeling that, you just made $1 billion and you're running down the street crying, which is, a cautionary tale. His opinions on surviving being the key priority of a business and how he structures his models to ensure that happens. Going into the opportunity of a lifetime, his idea about branded venture capital, which I thought was fascinating. Talks about why he likes 50-50 partnerships. His philosophy on building Virgin and the simple way he accomplishes this. His belief that big is not beautiful. All these interesting other ideas. And, of course, I'm going to elaborate more on how Virgin protects their downside risk, which I think is I love that idea, 100%. So if you want to hear that and 10 or 11 other member-only episodes, plus get a new one every week, and support a podcast that hopefully is providing you value, become a Founders member, founders.com/support. Every single link that I mentioned to you, obviously you don't have to remember the domain if you don't want to, because I include them in the show notes. If you want to read the book, or if you want to know what's in the book but you don't feel like reading it, another way you could support the podcast and that's mutually beneficial to you is there's a link down there that will give you 2 free audiobooks. And I think you use it soon though, because I think the link expires this December, if I'm not mistaken. Might be January. But in any case, if you want 2 free audiobooks, you can try Audible. And even if you cancel it, you get to keep the 2 books. So you can listen to this one, and I think next week's podcast is going to be on the book. So this one's called Losing My Virginity. And then his other autobiography that he released about 20 years after this one is called Finding My Virginity. So if you want to jump ahead and be ready for next week, you can get both those on Audible if you want that as well. In addition to that, I would appreciate if you join my email list. So Founders is meant, we're trying to learn about building companies from people that have built companies, right? And we're doing that primarily from a historical context, using biographies and autobiographies of entrepreneurs. Just like I've said before, like the genesis of the idea happened when I was listening to a podcast Elon Musk was on, and he was asked, hey, how did you, before you started a company, he's like, how did you learn about this? Did you read business books? And his reply was, no, I didn't read business books. I looked for knowledge in a historical context. And to that end, he's read a lot of biographies. He said, I think the direct quote is, biographies are helpful. So if Elon Musk thinks biographies are helpful, maybe they'd be helpful for all of us. And definitely from the feedback I'm getting, I find a lot of people that agree with that sentiment. I definitely do as well. So Founders takes care of it in a historical context. But what about all the people that are building companies right now? And so for that, Founders Notes, it's very simple. Takes notes on podcasts that entrepreneurs come on and talk about their business. They talk about where they got the idea from, how they got their first customers, what their business philosophies are, what tools they use are helpful, what books they read that they enjoy, that they think have an impact on their business. To me, like, these podcasts are like lectures from people that are some of the smartest people in the world that have domain expertise in a very narrow way. And that narrow way is building a very specific company. So it doesn't mean that all these ideas are applicable to you, but I do have a fundamental belief that you should collect as many ideas as possible, because you never know when an idea you might learn today might help you years from now. And people that are, whether executives, whether they're founders already or want to be founders, there's very few people that have as much leverage over information as entrepreneurs do. I think maybe only pure investors, being the other group. And to that end, like, you don't want to miss a good idea because you didn't have time to listen to a podcast or you just missed it. So the problem Founders Notes is solving is, you have all these really smart people talking about what they learn from building businesses. Like, how do you go and collect all that information and make it in a way you can easily digest? Like, so for that, we just take notes on the key ideas, and it turns, maybe an hour of audio turns into like a 5-minute read. And what if you could have 5 to 10 different founders every week appearing in your inbox, just giving you their best ideas? Well, that's what Founders Notes is. So if you want to sign up on the email list, foundersnotes.co. You go straight there. You put in your email address. Really simple, really fast. You'll get 1 to 2 of the notes that I take every week. And then if you like and you're learning from that, you can upgrade, and then you get 5 to 10. You get much more. And you get access to the entire archive. And the archive's growing rapidly. There's notes from 50, 58, maybe 60 plus founders already. So I just think it's unbelievably valuable for the tiny, tiny monthly fee that it is. So check it out. You might think that it's the same. And then finally, if you want to help out the podcast and get extra content from me for free, then leave a review, take a screenshot, email it to foundersreviews@gmail.com. I check this email address about once a week. And I will reply back with a private RSS feed, which is exactly what a podcast is. You just put it in your podcast player. It's really easy. And you have access to these podcasts that I do. They're episodes of Founders that I don't put in the main feed. I don't put in the members feed. I just send it to people that have taken time out of their day to recommend my podcast to other people. And that's unbelievably nice of you to do so. So I'd like to give you something in return for doing that. So let's say an Apple Podcast, a Stitcher, these things, it's easy. You can leave a review. You can talk about what you like about the podcast, screenshot it, send it to me. But a lot of you guys listen on Overcast and apps like that, like Breaker, things where there's no really review process. But there is a way to recommend that. And they use, so Overcast specifically uses a star. And they want you to star specific episodes. So go find, your favorite 1 or 2 episodes, or you just do it for 1 if you want to. I appreciate if you do it for more, but you don't have to. Find your favorite episode of Founders. You press a star, it'll turn like a gold color. You take a screenshot of that, email it to me, and I'll send you back this private RSS feed. And that way, what that does is, just lets other people become aware that this podcast exists. And that's the hardest thing about trying to bootstrap a podcast. I don't have a large social following. I'm not really into social media. And I'm not part of a podcast network. I'm just one guy reading books, highlighting it, recording, editing, and publishing it. So I do I have 0 people helping with this. And I like that because I want it to be more of like an intimate, I just wanted, the feeling I was getting is like, what if you could just sit down with a friend and tell them a bunch of interesting stuff that you read? And why don't I just record that so people all over the world can get these ideas too? So by you becoming members, by you signing up and paying for Founders Notes, by you leaving reviews, by you telling your friends, spreading it on social media, that's all those things are support. And that's only going to make these ideas go farther and hopefully, make sure that Founders can continue. I've said before that if you really step back and look at what, if this can go over a long enough time period, we are kind of documenting the history of entrepreneurship. So right now I'm on pace to read about 50 books this year. What does that look like when you do that over several years? And what is the value of all the ideas in here? Is there a better way to learn about entrepreneurship? The best way to learn about entrepreneurship is by doing something, trying to go out and sell something, right? And then the best way is by learning from people that have already done it. And both the podcast and the newsletter are trying to help you achieve that objective, which is, can we learn from the experience of other people that have already done what we're trying to do, and then apply those ideas in our own unique, useful way. So anyways, I think I've talked enough. With that, I will be back next week with part 2 of what may be maybe 3-part series. I'm not actually sure. We got to see how many of these books there's actually valuable information in. I have my guess is it's going to go 3 parts. But next week, you already know what it is, Finding My Virginity. Thank you very much. I'll talk to you then.